Chapter 1. Psychology as a Science. The definition of psychology. There are two questions which every human being, with rare exceptions, asks himself through most of his life. The rare exceptions are the persons who know the answer to the first of these questions, at least to a significant extent. But everyone asks the second, sometimes in wonder, often in despair. These two questions are, how am I to understand myself? And, how am I to understand other people? Historically, in the development of the human race and in the life of an individual, these questions constitute the starting point of, and initial impetus to, psychological investigation. The inquiry implicit in these questions can be cast in a wider, more abstract form. Why does a person act as he does? What would be required for him to act differently? Writing in the early years of this century, the German psychologist Hermann Ebbinghaus made an observation that has become famous. Psychology has a long past, but only a short history. His statement was intended to acknowledge the fact that, throughout recorded history, men have been intensely concerned with issues and problems of a psychological nature, but that psychology, as a distinct scientific discipline, emerged only in the second half of the 19th century. Up to that time, the domain of psychology had not been isolated as such and studied systematically. It existed only as a part of philosophy, medicine, and theology. The establishment of Wilhelm Wundt's experimental laboratory in 1879 is often regarded as the formal beginning of scientific psychology. But when one considers the views of man and the theories of his nature that have been put forth as knowledge in the past 100 years, it remains a moot question whether the starting date of the science of psychology lies behind us or ahead.
Science is the rational and systematic study of the facts of reality. Its aim is to discover laws of nature, to achieve a comprehensive, integrated knowledge that will make the universe intelligible to man. Man requires such knowledge in order to deal with reality successfully, in order to live. If nature, to be commanded, must be obeyed, then the purpose of science is to provide man with the intellectual means of his survival. A new science is born when, out of the countless questions that man asks concerning the nature of things, certain questions are isolated and then integrated into a distinct category, isolated and integrated by a defining principle that distinguishes these questions from all others and identifies their common characteristics. It took many centuries before physics, chemistry, biology, and physiology, for instance, were conceptualized as specific sciences. What is the science of psychology? How is it to be defined? What is its specific domain? Consider the following problems. They are typical of those with which psychology deals, and consider by what principle one is able to recognize that they are psychological. A scientist struggles to answer some difficult question that has arisen in his work. After months of effort, he feels no closer to a solution than when he began. Then, one day, while he is out for a walk, the solution unexpectedly flashes into his mind. What mental processes underlie and account for this phenomenon? The phenomenon of sudden insight, or inspiration. Among our acquaintances, we note that one person characteristically is serene, confident, even-tempered, that another is irritable, nervous, unsure of himself, that a third is tense, brooding, emotionally frozen, that a fourth is emotionally explosive, volatile, elated one moment and depressed the next. What accounts for such differences? What are the causes of a person's character and personality? What are character and personality? A man awakens in the middle of the night, his body trembling and his heart beating violently. To the best of his knowledge, he has no cause to be afraid. Yet what he feels is terror. Through a sleepless night, then through the days and weeks that follow, the sense of impending disaster persists. The dread invades him, as if some alien power had taken possession of his body. Finally, he seeks the help of a psychotherapist. He learns that his problem is shared, in varying degrees of intensity, by millions of people. It is called pathological anxiety. What is its cause? What does it signify? How is it to be cured? These examples pertain to human beings, but psychology is not restricted exclusively to the study of man. It includes the study of animals. When a scientist investigates the learning processes of a dog, or the relative effectiveness of reward and punishment on a monkey, or the family life of a chimpanzee, his pursuit and concern are distinctly psychological. If, on the other hand, a scientist studies the actions of astronomical bodies or the heliotropic action of a plant, His investigation is clearly not psychological. How do we recognize this? What is the principle of the difference?
Psychology is confined to the study of living organisms. Of all living organisms. No, of those living organisms which are conscious, which exhibit awareness. If one wishes to understand the definition and distinctive nature of a particular science, the question to answer is: what are the specific facts of reality that give rise to that science? For example, the basic fact of reality that gives rise to the science of biology is that certain entities in nature are alive. Thus, biology is the science that studies the attributes and characteristics which certain entities possess by virtue of being alive. That certain living organisms are conscious, that they are able to be aware of existence, is the basic fact of reality which gives rise to the science of psychology. Psychology is the science that studies the attributes and characteristics which certain living organisms possess by virtue of being conscious. This definition subsumes the study of behavior, of motivation, and of the structure, categories, and functions of consciousness. As such, it subsumes the areas covered by the traditional definitions of psychology as the science of consciousness, or the science of mind, or the science of mental activity, or the science of behavior. Consciousness is used here in its widest and most general sense, to indicate the faculty and state of awareness, of any form of awareness, from the complex mode of cognition possible to man, to the far more limited range of awareness possible to a frog. The more complex and highly developed the nervous system of a given species, the greater is the range of its consciousness, measured in terms of ability to discriminate, versatility of action or response, general capacity to cope with the external environment. Man's is the most highly developed nervous system and his is the widest range of awareness. The chimpanzee's is less, the cat's still less, the frog's still less.
Living species differ not only in their overall range of awareness but also in the sensitivity of specific sense modalities. A dog's sense of smell, for instance, is more developed than man's. In judging a given species' range of awareness, one does not consider the sensitivity of a particular sense modality out of context. One judges in terms of the species' overall capacity to discriminate and to vary action in coping with the environment. In the case of man, of course, his greatly superior power of discrimination is a product of his conceptual faculty. The fundamental question to be asked about any existing thing is it living or inanimate? The fundamental question to be asked about any living organism is it conscious or not? The fundamental question to be asked about any conscious organism is, what is its distinctive form of consciousness? Every living species that possesses awareness survives by the guidance of its consciousness. That is the role and function of consciousness in a living organism. One cannot understand the characteristic behavior of a particular species without reference to its specific form and range of awareness. Thus, the study of the psychology of any given species is the study of the attributes and characteristics which that species possesses by virtue of its distinctive form and range of consciousness. While psychology is concerned with all conscious organisms, it is primarily concerned with the study of man. The psychologist's interest in other species lies, predominantly, in the light his investigation might cast on human beings. The science of human psychology is the study of the attributes and characteristics which man possesses by virtue of his distinctive form and range of consciousness. The central and basic task of psychology is to understand the nature and consequences of man's distinctive form of awareness. This holds the key to understanding man behaviorally, motivationally, and characterologically. Man's defining attribute, which distinguishes him from all other living species, is his ability to reason. This means, to extend the range of his awareness beyond the perceptual concretes immediately confronting him, to abstract, to integrate, to grasp principles, to apprehend reality on the conceptual level of consciousness. Chapter 3. An animal's range is only as wide as its percepts. The rudimentary forms of inference of which it may be capable are entirely bound by and dependent on the physical cues within its immediate sensory field, in the context, of course, of past experience. It cannot conceptualize, it cannot initiate a process of question asking, it cannot project a chain of inference that is independent of immediate sensory stimuli. But man can chart, on the back of an envelope, the motion of planets through the outer reaches of space. Like every other species that possesses awareness, man survives by the guidance of his distinctive form of consciousness, i.e., by the guidance of his conceptual faculty. This is the first fact about man's nature that must be understood. This is the starting point of any scientific study of man, the basic principle without which no aspect of the distinctively human can be understood. Whether one is seeking to understand the nature of emotion, or the psychology of family relationships, or the causes of mental illness, or the meaning of love, or the significance of productive work, or the process of artistic creativeness, or sexual behavior, one must begin by identifying the fact upon which any subsequent analysis of man necessarily rests, that man is a rational being, a being whose distinctive form of consciousness is conceptual. Thus, psychology, as it pertains to man, is properly conceived and defined as the science that studies the attributes and characteristics which man possesses by virtue of his rational faculty.
Consciousness. Consciousness is an attribute of living organisms, an attribute of life at a certain level of development and organization. Consciousness denotes both a faculty and a state. As a faculty, consciousness means the attribute of certain living organisms which enables them to be aware of existence. I use faculty in the Aristotelian sense to designate a power or ability. As a state, consciousness is awareness, the condition of an organism in cognizing, perceiving, or sensing. The concept of consciousness as a state, the state of awareness, is a primary. It cannot be broken down any further or defined by reference to other concepts. There are no other concepts to which it can be reduced. It is the basic psychological concept and category to which all other psychological terms ultimately must refer. Only in the context of the phenomenon of awareness as one's root concept can such concepts as thought, idea, perception, imagination, memory, emotion, or desire be intelligible. One can investigate the structural and functional conditions in an organism that are necessary for the existence of consciousness. One can inquire into the neurophysiological means of consciousness, such as sensory receptors, afferent nerves, etc. One can differentiate levels and forms of consciousness. But the concept of consciousness as such is an irreducible primary. It is what Ayn Rand has termed an axiomatic concept. She writes, "Axioms are usually considered to be propositions identifying a fundamental, self-evident truth. But explicit propositions as such are not primaries. They are made of concepts. The base of man's knowledge of all other concepts, all axioms, propositions, and thought, consists of axiomatic concepts. An axiomatic concept is the identification of a primary fact of reality, which cannot be analyzed, i.e., reduced to other facts or broken into component parts. It is the fundamentally given and directly perceived or experienced, which requires no proof or explanation, but on which all proofs and explanations rest. The first and primary axiomatic concepts are existence, identity, which is a corollary of existence and consciousness. One can study what exists and how consciousness functions, but one cannot analyze or prove existence as such or consciousness as such. These are irreducible primaries. An attempt to prove them is self-contradictory. It is an attempt to prove existence by means of non-existence and consciousness by means of unconsciousness.
That mental processes are correlated with neural processes in the brain in no way affects the status of consciousness as a unique and irreducible primary. It is a species of what philosophers term the reductive fallacy to assert that mental processes are nothing but neural processes, that, for example, the perception of an object is a collection of neural impulses, or that a thought is a certain pattern of brain activity. A perception and the neural processes that mediate it are not identical, nor are a thought and the brain activity that may accompany it. Such an equation is flagrantly anti-empirical and logically absurd. As one philosopher observes, maintains that consciousness is a form of brain activity, that it is either some fine and subtle kind of matter, or more commonly, some form of energy, either kinetic or potential. To say that consciousness is a form of matter or of motion is to use words without meaning. Argument against any given position must regularly take the general form of the reductio ad absurdum. He, therefore, who chooses at the beginning a position which is as absurd as any that can be imagined is in the happy situation of being armor-proof against all argument. He can never be reduced to the absurd because he is already there. If he cannot see that, though consciousness and motion may be related as intimately as you please, we mean different things by the two words, that though consciousness may be caused by motion, it is not itself what we mean by motion any more than it is green cheese. If he cannot see this, there is no arguing with him. To quote another philosopher. We speak of an idea as clear or confused, as apposite or inapposite, as witty or dull. Are such terms intelligible when applied to those motions of electrons, atoms, molecules, or muscles, which are all there is to consciousness? Can a motion be clear, or cogent, or witty? What exactly would a clear motion be like? What sort of thing is a germane or cogent reflex, or a witty muscular reaction? These adjectives are perfectly in order when applied to ideas. They become at once absurd when applied to movements in muscle or nerve. On the other side, movements have attributes which are unthinkable as applied to ideas. Movements have velocity. But what is the average velocity of one's ideas on a protective tariff? Movements have direction. Would there be any sense in talking of the northeasterly direction of one's thought on the morality of revenge? It is true that whereas matter can exist apart from consciousness, consciousness cannot exist apart from matter, i.e., apart from a living organism. But this dependence of consciousness on matter does not in any way support the claim that they are identical. On the contrary, as more than one critic of reductive materialism has pointed out, it is reasonable to speak of one thing being dependent on another only if they are not identical.
In the writings of Aristotle, one finds a treatment of consciousness and of life that is signally superior to the approach of most moderns. There are many respects in which, when one studies the history of philosophy, moving from Aristotle to Descartes to the present, one feels as though history were moving backward, not forward, as if most of Aristotle's successors down through the ages have been pre-Aristotelians. Aristotle is neither a mystic nor a materialist. He does not regard consciousness as supernatural, as an incomprehensible and irksome presence in a mechanistic universe, to be banished by reduction to the blind motion of inanimate particles, like an exile whom the authorities found discomfiting. To Aristotle, consciousness is a natural fact of reality, the characteristic attribute of certain entities. In this issue, his approach is far more empirical than that of most empiricists. His example should serve as a lead to those who desire to pursue a genuinely scientific study of conscious living organisms. The only consciousness of which one has direct and immediate knowledge is one's own. One knows the consciousness of other beings only indirectly, inferentially, through outward physical expression in action. This does not mean that one can achieve exhaustive knowledge of the nature and laws of mental activity, merely by introspection. It means that each man can directly experience only his own consciousness. The consciousness of other beings can never be the object of his direct perception of experience. Communication among men concerning psychological states is possible because each man has his own inner psychological laboratory to which he can refer. To clarify this metaphor, if a man has never had the experience of sight, there is no way to communicate the experience to him. No discussion of light waves, retinas, rods, and cones could make sight meaningful to a man who has been blind since birth. Like the basic attributes of physical objects, such as extension and mass, the basic categories of consciousness can be defined only ostensively, i.e., by reference to direct experience. Just as extrospective ostensive definitions are indispensable to any communication among men concerning the physical world, so introspective ostensive definitions are indispensable to any communication concerning the psychological realm. These extrospective and introspective observables are the base on which all more complex concepts, and all subsequent, inferential knowledge, are built.
Introspection is the first source of one's psychological knowledge, and without introspection no other avenue of psychological knowledge could be significant or meaningful, even if it were possible. The study of behavior, or of the descriptive self-reports of other men, or of cultures and cultural products, would yield one nothing, if one had no apprehension of such phenomena as ideas, beliefs, memories, emotions, desires, to which one could relate one's observations and in terms of which one could interpret one's findings. Strictly speaking, of course, it is absurd to imagine that, if one had no awareness of such categories, one could be engaged in the study of anything. While introspection is a necessary condition and source of psychological knowledge, it is not sufficient by itself, neither one's own introspection nor the introspective reports of others. Psychology requires the study of the outward manifestations and expressions of mental activity, behavior. Consciousness is the regulator of action. Consciousness cannot be fully understood without reference to behavior, and behavior cannot be understood without reference to consciousness. Man is neither a disembodied ghost nor an automaton. Scientific psychology requires that the data of introspection and the observations of beings in action be systematically integrated into coherent knowledge. A theory, to be valid, must integrate all and contradict none of the relevant evidence or data, and this entails the necessity of taking cognizance of everything that is relevant. In the light of the foregoing, it is appropriate to comment briefly on a curious phenomenon in modern psychology, the doctrine of behaviorism.
The revolt against consciousness. In order, allegedly, to establish psychology as a genuine science, on a part with the physical sciences, behaviorism proposes the following program: to dispense with the concept of consciousness, to abandon all concern with mythical mental states, and to study exclusively an organism's behavior, i.e., to restrict psychology to the study of physical motions. For this reason, a writer on the history of psychology aptly entitled his chapter on behaviorism, "Psychology Out of Its Mind." Sometimes a distinction is made between radical behaviorism and methodological behaviorism. Radical behaviorism is explicit reductive materialism. It holds that mind is a series of bodily responses, such as muscular and glandular reactions. The gross untenability of this doctrine has already been noted. The advocates of methodological behaviorism frequently repudiate this doctrine as unsophisticated and philosophical. Their form of behaviorism, they insist, makes no metaphysical commitment whatever, i.e., no commitment about the fundamental nature of man or of mind. It is entirely procedural. It merely holds that consciousness, whatever that might be, is not an object of scientific study, and that scientific psychology must confine itself to an analysis of observed behavior without reference to mentalistic data and without recourse to any concepts derived by means of introspection. A methodology, however, to be valid, must be appropriate to its subject. Therefore, it necessarily entails a view of the nature of its subject. Methodological behaviorism implies that the organisms which psychology studies are such that their behavior can be understood without reference to consciousness. And this, clearly, is a metaphysical position. Methodological behaviorists may wish to deny that they are reductive materialists. But then, as a minimum, their doctrine entails a belief in another, no more promising version of materialism, epiphenomenalism, the doctrine that consciousness is merely an incidental byproduct of physical processes, as smoke is a byproduct of a locomotive, and that conscious events have no causal efficacy, neither with regard to bodily events nor to other mental events, i.e., one's thoughts do not have the power to affect either one's actions or one's subsequent thoughts. Thus, epiphenomenalism commits its advocates to the position that the history of the human race would be exactly the same if no one had ever been conscious of anything, if no one had any perceptions or thoughts. As a philosophical position, epiphenomenalism is scarcely more defensible than reductive materialism, neither is very impressive in the light of even a cursory logical analysis. The difference between these two variations of behaviorism is, for any practical purpose, non-existent. Both agree that consciousness is irrelevant to psychology and to behavior. This is the essence of their position.
The behaviorist has been conspicuously reluctant to enunciate the conclusions to which his theory leads. he has not, for instance, felt obliged to declare, since phenomena of consciousness are illusory or irrelevant to explanations of behavior, and since this includes my behavior, nothing that I may think, understand, or perceive, whatever these terms mean, bears any causal relation to the things I do or the theories I advocate. When a person puts forth a doctrine which amounts to the assertion either that he is not conscious or that it makes no difference to him, and should make no difference to others, whether he is conscious or not, the irresistible temptation is to agree with him. Many writers, of the most varied and divergent viewpoints, have exposed the arbitrariness, the contradictions, and the epistemological barbarism of the behaviorist theory. It is unnecessary to review their criticisms here. Behaviorists, in line with their general policy of dismissing those aspects of reality which they find it inconvenient to consider, have not attempted, for the most part, to answer these criticisms. They have ignored them. The chief focus of the behaviorists' attack is on the psychologist's use of introspection. Their argument is as follows: psychology has failed to establish itself as a science or to produce any genuine knowledge. The fault lies in the psychologist's reliance on introspection. The physical sciences, which are far more advanced, do not employ introspection. Therefore, psychology should abandon introspection and emulate the methods of the physical sciences. It should, like physics, study the actions of material entities, i.e., study observable behavior. This program has led, on the part of behaviorists, to an orgy of experiments and measurements, with only this difference from the physical sciences, that behaviorists have been notoriously unclear as to what their experiments are to accomplish, what they are measuring, why they are measuring it, or what they expect to know when their measurements are completed. The practical success of their program has been nil. This does not mean that every experiment performed by an advocate of behaviorism necessarily has been valueless, but that its value, if any, bears no intrinsic relation to the behaviorist thesis, i.e., the experiment did not require or depend on the experimenter's commitment to behaviorism. Behaviorists were scarcely the first to recognize that psychology requires, among other things, the study of behavior under experimentally controlled conditions.
It is true that psychology has failed as yet to establish itself as a science. It is also true that classical introspectionists, such as Wundt, Titchener, and members of the so-called Würzburg school, were guilty of grave errors in their concept of the nature, scope, and methods of psychology. But the behaviorist program represents, not a solution or a step forward, but the abdication of psychology as such. While posturing as the expression of scientific objectivity, behaviorism, in fact, represents a collapse to methodological subjectivism. To be objective is to be concerned with facts, excluding one's wishes, hopes, or fears from cognitive consideration. Objectivity rests on the principle that that which is, that facts are not created or altered by the wishes or beliefs of the perceiver. If, therefore, a scientist decides to study a given aspect of reality, objectivity requires that he adjust his methods of investigation to the nature of the field being studied. Ends determine means. He does not, arbitrarily, because it suits his convenience, select certain methods of investigation and then decree that only those facts are relevant which are amenable to his methods. No one, including the behaviorist, can escape the knowledge, a. that he is conscious and, b. that this is a fact about himself of the greatest importance, a fact which is indispensable to any meaningful account of his behavior. If the behaviorist is unequal to the task of formulating scientific epistemological principles for the use of introspection and for the integration of introspective data with psychological data obtained by other means, he is not justified in seeking to reduce an entire field to the level of his inadequacy. Arbitrarily to define the nature of conscious organisms in such a way as to justify one's preferred method of study is subjectivism. Behaviorists frequently attempt to defend their position by means of an epistemological confusion which they did not originate, but which is very common today among psychologists and philosophers, the argument that since states of consciousness are private and since, therefore, they are not publicly observable, they cannot be the subject of objective, scientific knowledge.
Phenomena of consciousness are private, in the sense indicated earlier, namely, that the only consciousness a man can experience directly is his own. But, as was also indicated, the inferences a psychologist makes, on the basis of his introspection, concerning the nature and functions of consciousness, may be checked by his fellow workers, who also have recourse to introspection, just as one scientist checks on the reported findings of another by repeating the other's experiment in his own laboratory. If psychologists sometimes disagree about what they perceive, or about the correct interpretation of what they perceive, this is true of physical scientists also. And the method of resolving such differences is, in principle, the same: to investigate further, to compare data more carefully, to define terms more precisely, to explore other, possibly relevant facts, to check their conclusions in the light of the rest of their knowledge, to search for contradictions or non sequiturs in their reports. The objectivity of one's conclusions depends, not on whether they are derived from publicly observable data, but on a. whether they are true, i.e., consonant with the facts of reality, and on b. the rationality of one's method of arriving at them. Conclusions arrived at by a rational method can be confirmed by other men and are, in this sense, publicly verifiable. But the objective and the publicly observable, or verifiable, are not synonymous. Whatever men may learn from one another, each man, epistemologically, is alone. Knowing is not a social process. If one man's judgment is unreliable and non-objective, because it is his own, 100 unreliable, non-objective judgments will not yield a reliable, objective one. So much for the mystique of the publicly observable. The behaviorist assault on consciousness merely represents the extreme of a more general trend in modern psychology and philosophy, the tendency to regard consciousness or mind with suspicious hostility, as a disturbing, unnatural phenomenon which somehow must be explained away or, at the last, barred from the realm of the scientifically knowable. For centuries, mystics have asserted that phenomena of consciousness are outside the reach of reason and science. The modern, scientific, apostles of the anti-mind agree. While proclaiming themselves exponents of reason and enemies of supernaturalism, they announce, in effect, that only insentient matter is natural, and thereby surrender man's consciousness to mysticism. They have conceded to the mystics a victory which the mystics could not have won on their own. It is from such neo-mysticism that a genuinely scientific psychology must reclaim man's mind as a proper object of rational study.